Well, the plot thickened today in the mystery of Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. The Financial Times reported late today that Donald Trump sat down for a meeting that was at least 15 minutes long with Vladimir Putin at the G20 summit in November after President Trump publicly announced that he canceled a one-on-one meeting with Vladimir Putin at that same summit because of recent Russian aggression against Ukraine. President Trump did not have an American translator or a staff note taker with him in that meeting. Vladimir Putin did have his translator present, and so only the Russians really know what was said in that meeting. The Financial Times report came at the end of what was already an historic day in the Senate Intelligence Committee on this very subject, when the leaders of America's intelligence agencies refused to publicly answer the question, does the President of the United States' secret discussions with Vladimir Putin put the United States at a disadvantage in dealing with Russia?
According to press reports, Donald Trump met privately with Vladimir Putin, and no one in the U.S. government has the full story about what was discussed. Director Hardball and Director Coates, would this put you in a disadvantaged position in terms of understanding Russia's efforts to advance its agenda against the United States? Question for you two, and then I'm out of time. Thank you for letting me have them respond, Mr. Chairman.
Well, Senator, clearly this is a sensitive issue, and it's an issue we ought to talk about this afternoon. I look forward to discussing that in a closed session.
The hearing also made history when the heads of the intelligence agencies in the Trump administration completely disagreed with President Trump on a series of national security issues. President Trump said, quote, there is no longer a nuclear threat from North Korea. And here is what his Director of National Intelligence, Dan Coates, and Director of the CIA, Gina Haspel, said about that today.
We currently assess that North Korea will seek to retain its WMD capabilities and is unlikely to completely give up its nuclear weapons and production capabilities because its leaders ultimately view nuclear weapons as critical to regime survival.
What would you say is the current state of the threat from North Korea?
The regime is committed to developing a long-range nuclear armed missile that would pose a direct threat to the United States.
And of course, President Trump famously claims that he has destroyed ISIS.
We have won against ISIS. We've beaten them, and we've beaten them badly.
Today, the Director of National Intelligence said that ISIS still has thousands of fighters and is resurging.
While ISIS is nearing territorial defeat in Iraq and Syria, the group has returned to its guerrilla warfare roots while continuing to plot attacks and direct its supporters worldwide. ISIS is intent on resurging and still commands thousands of fighters in Iraq and Syria.
And when discussing the deal with Iran negotiated by the Obama administration that prevents Iran from developing nuclear weapons, the Trump administration officials sounded like Obama administration officials. Even though President Trump broke that deal with Iran, the Trump administration officials say that Iran is still complying with the Obama administration's deal.
We do not believe Iran is currently undertaking activities we judge necessary to produce a nuclear device.
Since our departure from the deal, they have abided by the terms. You're saying they're considering, but at the current moment, they're...
Yes, they're making some preparations that would increase their ability to take a step back if they make that decision. So at the moment, technically, they're in compliance.
In the hours of testimony about the Intelligence Service's annual report on the worldwide threat assessment, the Trump administration officials did not support President Trump's argument that we need a wall on the southern border for national security. The Trump administration intelligence officials did not say one word about a wall, and even more importantly, from a political perspective, on the future prospects of such a wall ever being built. None of the Republican senators on the committee asked a single question about any threat to the United States at our southern border. And one of the members of the committee is the senior senator from Texas, John Cornyn, who represents the single largest section of the southern border in the United States Senate. Not one word about a wall or a national security threat at our southern border. Leading off our discussion now is Ambassador Wendy Sherman, an MSNBC Global Affairs contributor. And John McLaughlin is with us. He's a former acting director of the CIA and an MSNBC national security analyst. And Ambassador Sherman, I want to start with you. And really, I leave it to you to pick what we learned today in that hearing do you think deserves the most important concentration tonight?
Well, I think there are two things, Lawrence. One, of course, that the intelligence community is completely at odds with the President of the United States. We don't rely on the intelligence community to define policy, which I'm sure John will discuss, but we do think that their data, their assessments, their facts are important to constructing policy. And clearly, the president from January 22nd, right after the inauguration, when he really denigrated the CIA, visiting the wall of the fallen CIA agents, we know that the president really won't pay any attention to these assessments because facts don't matter. But secondly, within this analysis, the intelligence community told us that Russia and China are aligning their interests and working more and more together, that the United States government does not have a comprehensive strategy for dealing with Russian interference in the U.S. election, which they expect to be front and center again in 2020. Both of these things are of great concern. And in the strategy that Director Coates put out earlier this week, he indeed said that the retreat by the West and by implication, the United States, from the world community and from the global community has left a vacuum that is being filled by our enemies and our adversaries.
John McLaughlin, was it ever conceivable to you prior to the Trump presidency that you could have the heads of these intelligence agencies testifying to the United States Senate and not being able to say a simple no publicly to the question, does the President of the United States put the United States at a disadvantage in dealing with Russia because of his secret communications with Russia?
No, I don't think that could have happened in any other time or any other administration. And as Wendy pointed out, this was a remarkable hearing in many respects. I was proud of this community because I always call these people the fact witnesses. In other words, at a time when facts are debatable and truth is challenged, these are the people who are supposed to come in and say, here's what you can believe, here's the way it works. But there's another dimension to this that occurred to me. I've been thinking about it all day because the fact that there was such a gulf between the president and these people on key issues is one thing. There's another thing that was a little remarkable here. These people had their act together. It was coherent. They clearly worked together well. They knew their facts. They had nuance. They were prepared to say what they thought. It all made sense. That's a rather rare thing in this government these days. And I think that is kind of a greater than the sum of the parts aspect to this hearing today.
And Wendy Sherman, one thing I was struck by when Dan Coates took that question about, is the president putting us at a disadvantage? It seemed to be something he was ready for. It seemed to be something he anticipated. He clearly wasn't happy to have to deal with it at all, but he clearly knew what he was going to have to say, and that was one where he was going to have to say, I can't answer you publicly. We're going to have to wait for the closed session.
Yes, it made me think, Lawrence, of the Aspen Security Conference, which I attended over the summer, and Andrea Mitchell of NBC and MSNBC interviewed Coates and asked him about the Helsinki summit with Vladimir Putin. And clearly, Coates probably got in some trouble because he said he wouldn't have approached the meeting in quite the way the president did. And then Andrea broke the news to him that the president had invited Putin to the White House. And quite frankly, Director Coates was gobsmacked. And my guess is he got a little bit in trouble for that as well. So I think today he was trying to be very careful not to go too far here, but clearly his feeling about all of this was evident. He doesn't believe what the president believes. He is very concerned about what's happening with Russia, and he wanted to talk with the members about this in private.
And John McLaughlin, you don't have to be in the intelligence community to know that ISIS has not been defeated. That wasn't, I don't think, a surprise to anyone.
Right.
To hear that all you have to do is have a newspaper, access to a newspaper, to know that there are thousands of members of ISIS and that they are resurging in certain ways. The North Korea information was an intelligence assessment that most people are not in a position to make. We don't really know what's going on in North Korea. And there's Donald Trump's administration saying there's been no appreciable progress with North Korea. Not only that, but the regime's own definition of its survival turns on the North Korean regime retaining nuclear weapons.
Right, and we know even from publicly available information, Lawrence, that they continue to enrich uranium. We know that they are, one of the think tanks in Washington just did a very credible report that they are also modernizing a base that would be the base from which an ICBM would be launched toward the United States. So it's evident that that program is not going as the president has indicated. And there's another thing that's buried in this report that I don't think anyone has noticed yet. If you look at the foreword of the written statement, in very careful language, the Director of National Intelligence says, many of our allies are pulling away from us because of concerns about our security policies and our trade policies. It's carefully phrased, so it doesn't jump out at you. But can you imagine if that were to be said in any other administration, it would be a headline item.
Yeah.
The chief intelligence officer of the United States talking about diminishing fidelity among our allies because of our policies.
And that would be considered an emergency, not anything that we've seen at the southern border. And Wendy Sherman, I want to talk to you about the Iran deal. You helped negotiate that deal. You were in the room with Secretary Kerry, Secretary Moniz, working on it as an Undersecretary of State every day of those negotiations. And there you heard Trump administration officials sounding, I think, something very close to what we would have heard from Hillary Clinton administration officials at this point, only they would have had an Iran deal still in place. Here are the Trump administration officials saying, even though Donald Trump tore up the American end of the deal, Iran is still complying.
Indeed, and the International Atomic Energy Agency, which monitors this deal, has said in many reports now that they have been complying with the deal. But one other point about Iran. The president and his administration has tried to put maximum pressure on Iran by leaving the deal and increasing sanctions, trying to enforce those sanctions, working with others. But in fact, the behavior in the region that we are all very concerned about has not improved. It's actually gotten worse because the really hardliners of Iran feel they won, that they proved that the United States was not to be trusted or respected, and they feel that they can now act with impunity in the Middle East. So, in fact, the president's withdrawal and his actions have made us less safe, not more safe.
John McLaughlin, to the point we led with tonight, which is this late report today that there's been another secret meeting, Donald Trump sitting down with Vladimir Putin, no Americans present, no one who could translate except the Russian translator who works for Vladimir Putin. This comes after a day where the intelligence agencies were already exposed to trying to deal with this, and they said, we can't talk about it publicly, have to talk about it in private session. It turns out there's even more to talk about in that private session than the senators knew when they were questioning the intelligence officials today.
Yeah, you know, if I could be a fly on the wall or if I could talk to the Russian translator, I think what I would want to know most is, what is it that Putin says? What is it that is so persuasive about him that enables the president to say with a straight face, they didn't do anything?
I believe him. I
believe them. I don't know why they would. Is it the force of personality from a KGB officer? They're good at this. Or does he have some sort of logical presentation that refutes the facts? Does Trump present him the facts? We have no idea of what that dialogue is really like. It may just be that they're, kindred souls or something.
But the other part of it is we don't actually have any idea what they talk about. I mean, we don't know what they talk about.
No. Let's take at face value what the president has said a number of times, that it would be good to have a better relationship with Russia. I mean, I can't dispute that. That's true. But how you get there is the important point. And in my experience dealing with Russia, the most important thing that you can do with them is to tell them what you know and what you think. And when you know that they're not telling you the truth, they won't acknowledge it, but that they know you know changes the dynamic. And I just don't think that's going on here. So I think this is a KGB officer who's got, a lot of influence over his partner.
Wendy Sherman, a quick last word on these private Trump-Putin conversations that remain absolutely secret and no one in the American government actually knows what's said.
Incredibly dangerous. President Putin understands English. Donald Trump doesn't understand Russian. We have no idea really how the translation's going back and forth, and many of us believe, John would probably know this better than I, that the Russians have a complete transcript of everything that went on in that meeting. They are quite cognizant of it. They are making use of it, and our government hasn't a clue.
Former acting CIA director, Russians have a transcript.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
You bet.
We're going to have to leave it there. Ambassador Wendy Sherman, Director John McLaughlin, thank you both for joining us tonight. Really appreciate it. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.